That was long, I know. And the banner, unfortunately, didn't just evaporate, it was stolen. We've got it on film. Some people. Okay, well, I know it's August, but I have a Super Bowl story, because you know how much I love baseball, right? Okay, so there was a diehard fan at the game, and he noticed that there was an empty seat. And he mentioned it to the woman that was sitting next to it. "It was my husband," she said, "but he died." "I'm so sorry," said the man, "but, I'm really surprised that one of his friends or a relative or somebody didn't jump on the opportunity to have that seat." And she said, "Beats me. They all insisted on going to the funeral." I guess we all have our priorities. The story of David, now this is the same David that Hazel talked about last week. David's reign was about 1,000 years before Jesus, and took place in what is now Israel. And his reign was, I guess you could say it was colorful. It was full of intrigue and theft and abuse and lying and rape and murder and betrayal and conflict. Now, this particular conflict, though, started when David's daughter, Tamar, was raped by her half-brother, and David didn't punish the rapist. So you can already tell this is going to be a lovely story, right? So Tamar's full brother, Absalom, that's who Cheryl read to us about, Absalom, killed the rapist. So Absalom had to flee, but when he came back from exile, he promised people that he would be a more just and righteous king than David. And with popular backing, he raised an army, and King David had to run. And I've left out the twists and turns in this amusing little story, like the public raping by Absalom of David's 10 secondary wives. The story of this conflict, it's a long one, and we're not going to go over all of it. But in chapter 18, we are approaching the climax. David's forces were getting ready to fight back against Absalom's rebellion. The troops were about to go out to risk their lives for David. And he had some final words for them. Now, this wasn't the usual pep talk with all the hype and the focus on victory. David's only order: "For my sake, protect my boy Absalom," who just happened to be the leader of the rebellion. Everybody heard these words. David was allowing his soldiers to kill any Israelite except the leader of the rebellion. He was commanding those who were risking their lives for him not to fight to win. Now, if you're cynical, I'd never be cynical. If you're cynical, and it's hard to read these stories without being cynical, you might suspect that David's very public orders to his commanders not to harm Absalom may just have been a cover-up for his own involvement. Just saying. But let's take the story at face value. The actual battle doesn't get much attention, but it's important that the narrator said that even nature fought for David. Cheryl read, "The forest devoured more soldiers than the sword that day." That's the author's way of saying that God was fighting for David. And the writers would not have been alone in believing this. So Absalom ended up in a tree, and he was helpless. It would have been, as would have been appropriate for a royal figure, Absalom was riding a mule, and the critter turned and scooted under this big oak tree, and Absalom's head got wedged in the branches, and the mule took off. It's a really bizarre image. Absalom just hanging there. He had the huge armies of Israel to protect him. He had a quick means of escape. He'd have the mule, and Absalom couldn't get away. Again, the narrator was saying that God was fighting for David. Why? That's another story for another time. So, enter Joab. He was David's nephew, and he was the commander of David's troops. And Joab heard about Absalom's situation. It seems Joab decided that the only way to end the civil war was to kill Absalom. And he found him, just where he'd been told. Joab didn't vacillate. He didn't second guess. He killed him. Once Absalom died, Joab stopped the fighting, And all the Israelites, meaning the many that had been supporting Absalom, fled. And Joab and the army didn't even chase him. No one else needed to die. The body of Absalom was disposed of, and he was not excessively mourned by Joab or the army. It was a great victory. That was the end of the revolution. And the mule is never heard of again, but she'd already done her part. But as Cheryl read, King David wasn't with his troops for this great victory. He was back in the city, in his chamber above the gate, pathetically repeating the name of his dead son, the one that he had been really indifferent about all along. And what about the soldiers? Well, what should have been a celebration had turned really sour. It said the troops crept back into the city, like soldiers creep back ashamed after they fled from battle. But they hadn't fled. They had won. So Joab was told about David's reaction, and this was a really risky time for him. Remember, he had been told specifically, explicitly, not to harm Absalom. But the state has its demands, even in times of grief, and somebody had to attend to those demands. And in Jerusalem, it was Joab who stayed focused on the outcome. He knew that allowing Absalom to live was going to be disastrous for the nation because it was going to pave the way for more conflict and more civil war. And not only that, Joab knew that David's ingratitude was just killing the morale of the army, which, by the way, David's political life depended on this army. So Joab walked into the king's chambers, and he really let him have it. Today, you have humiliated your servants who have saved your life. And there were certainly other people grieving that day too, not for Absalom, but for their own sons and husbands and brothers dead in the service of David. Many have died to save your crown, David. Joab pointed out David was moaning over an enemy who had raped his wives and usurped his throne. And he was insulting the people who had risked their lives for him. And if they didn't get a signal that their risk mattered more than the life of that traitor, they would just walk away. Get back on track, David. Remember the goal, remember the mission. So David went out. His appearance, arranged by Joab, restored order, restored confidence. The people were reassured, and life could go on. Okay, so what? Well, what matters for the biblical authors, and by implication, what it would have been really appropriate for David to care about, was fidelity to the mission. Emotions are a part of life, but don't let them get in the way when you got to do hard work, not when you're the king. Remember, Jesus said, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." The mission is what matters. So, who was fighting for the mission? We have 3 candidates. I thought this was an appropriate time to talk about candidates. Number 1, David. David was a scumbag. He was ruthless, he was cruel, and I was crying over the loss of a son who wanted him dead. He'd been one miserable father, and he seems to have chosen the time of Absalom's rebellion to decide that he actually cared about him, and his ability to make rational decisions just went out the window. Candidate number 2, fighting for the mission, Absalom. Ruthless, initiated a civil war, guilty of sexual violations, and dead. The writer wasn't interested in him. Whatever his reasons for rebelling, and they could have been good ones. Maybe he really would have been a better king than David, but we're taking this at face value. Whatever his reasons, Absalom ended up dead in a ditch, skewered like a pincushion. And finally, number 3, Joab. Ruthless, decisive, unhesitatingly skewered a helpless man. Who will you vote for to lead the mission? I'm voting for Joab. He was focused and committed. He'd already shown that he'd work for whatever was best for the stability of the kingdom, and there'd never been any doubt about that. Joab could see that for there to be peace, one of the kings had to die. And if Joab had his way, that was going to be Absalom. Joab knew where his ultimate loyalty was. Notice that as soon as the usurper was dead, Joab stopped the war. Let the army go home. It's over. Joab knew what was good for the largest number of people. He knew what was good for Israel. He knew what would benefit David, even when David didn't. So he acted. Joab's clear-headed toughness saved David's throne that day, saved the nation from endless civil war. So what do we do with all this? Well, how did Joab make the decision to disobey David and kill Absalom? It was risky. It was violent. Think about good decision-making steps. Identify the problem. Get all the facts. Consider the alternatives. Pray. Talk with trusted friends. Take your time deciding. We don't see Joab doing any of that stuff. We don't see him praying. Now, wouldn't that be cool if Joab asked God what he should do and God wrote across the sky in bright green letters, "Stick stakes in Absalom." But it doesn't usually work that way. And we don't see Joab consulting the other leaders. There was no war council. There was no checking the facts. There was no considering alternatives. There's just Joab running out there with his handful of sticks. And that's how it goes sometimes. Something seemingly insignificant happens. A mule turns the wrong direction, and everything changes. And then we have to make a decision. Without consulting others, there isn't time. We don't have time to wait for God to answer. We don't have time to get all the facts. Maybe they're not available, and we have to decide much more quickly than we would like. And yet we have to decide right now. So how did Joab do it? How did he make that very important decision? He had already determined his ultimate allegiance. The story writers tell us that God had promised his kingdom to David for him to rule it with justice, and Joab took that real seriously. His mission was to do whatever it took to work that plan, and in this case, it required disobeying the one who ruled that kingdom. David wouldn't make maybe he couldn't because he was too old, David wouldn't make the decision that would keep the kingdom intact. The war wouldn't end until one of the kings was dead, and Joab had right in front of him, right here, right now, the means to determine which king would die. Joab's loyalty was to the monarchy, and he made his decision based on that loyalty. Do we have ultimate loyalties? Do you? Do you have a basis for making the big decisions? I'm not suggesting we adopt Joab's. I'm not advocating for ultimate loyalty to a government, to Israel, to a leader, to a military outcome. And I'm certainly not advocating that we skewer people with sticks. Well, most people. But the point is, while only you can decide your ultimate loyalty, if you don't know, you will never make good decisions. Without knowing where we're going and what we most value, we're like dust in the wind. We're just blowing around from place to place, no purpose, no direction. We have to know the mission before that big decision presents itself, before the mule turns. We have a lot of decisions to make right now. As individuals, I'm sure you've got a lot of decisions that you have to make. As a church, what do we want to be? As a nation, what matters? Who matters? I would challenge you over the week to think about your loyalties. How do your loyalties line up with what you see as God's priorities? If God's mission is justice, just like we read in the call to worship, how do our agendas support that? As individuals, as Parkside, now be thinking about that so that when the research team does their survey, you know what matters to you. you know what it is that you want for Parkside. The team wants to know. And it's worth thinking about in advance. When it comes to Parkside, what matters? What do you want to see? Which way do you want us to go? We have a decision to make as a nation. I heard there's an election coming up. What are you ready to sacrifice for? With your time, with your money, with your voice, maybe with your relationships or your status. If you have to decide quickly, decide alone, without as much information as you would like, how will you do it? What matters is the mission. What's yours?